My thoughts on it, that's pretty broad. I believe that we've reached a point where indeed it's a problem. There is an element or a truth to that there, especially because of the size of our economy, that debt in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's when it becomes too large of a share of GDP, and the trajectory of it is going to be only grow over the next few years exponentially because of rising healthcare costs and things like that. So I do think it's at a place where it's in our long-term best interest to actually do something about it.
Well, I think especially on the national debt, we need to restructure both the way we raise money in the federal government and the way that we're spending money in the federal government. Obviously what we're doing right now is unsustainable. That's why we owe over $13 trillion in debt. I think it's hurting the overall economy, and I think it's something that Congress needs to address and the President needs to address sooner rather than later.
Well, I think the majority of our debt obviously comes from defense and healthcare related expenses. And I think those are the two things that need to be dealt with the most directly, but they're the two things that aren't being dealt with at all, essentially. So when people talk about cutting wasteful spending to reduce the debt, I think that's kind of funny because our debt's not caused by wasteful spending, which is like 1% of our budget. It's caused by the 2/3 of our budget that are the most important that nobody wants to deal with.
Now specifically, I think the biggest problems are overall a tax structure that is really, I would say, has revenue a little bit lower than it should be. But I also think that defense spending is quite a bit out of control, and healthcare costs are out of control, and therefore, and our government is with Medicare and Medicaid, is a large provider of health insurance to a lot of people, and so it spends a lot of money on healthcare.
I think there's several main causes. I think one thing that we obviously can't ignore is that healthcare costs have gone up. And so through Medicare and Medicaid, that's been an increased cost for the government. So there's been increased spending for the government with Medicare and Medicaid, and that's something that can't be ignored. And any efficiencies that we could find nationally in that healthcare sector, especially for the cost for Medicare and Medicaid, would be a huge savings for the federal government. I think the other thing we need to look at is our defense spending. We've been in Afghanistan for 10 years, spending billions of dollars every single year. We've been in Iraq since 2003, spending billions of dollars every year that we've been there. So I think by withdrawing from Iraq like we're doing at the end of this year, and I think getting out of Afghanistan as soon as possible, are three of the areas where we've got such a huge debt that have caused this debt, that if we could address those three issues quickly, that would have a huge improvement on the debt.
Well, in my opinion, the stimulus stuff was a disaster. I'm not a big fan of bailing out big business and expecting regular people to pay for it with their tax dollars when the government already is in so much debt. And especially when you're spending money that you don't have to bail out people who intentionally did irresponsible things. So like the GM bailout or the bailing out of a lot of the banks on Wall Street, while people like me who haven't got a raise in 3 years and are starting families, like, who bailed me out? Like, I didn't do anything irresponsible. So I think it's wasteful. I don't think it's meant to be, but I think it's wasteful and irresponsible not to hold people accountable who make decisions regarding the economy and who give mortgages to people who shouldn't have gotten mortgages in the name of making money for themselves. So that's what I think.
No. Because, first of all, defense spending has already been greatly reduced with the reduction of the wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. We have reduced the many, many, many billions of dollars that were going there per month. It's still a lot, but it's been reduced.
I think if we could cut the military spending, that's a huge piece of it. And politically, that's going to be difficult. It's politically difficult to cut spending for the military because people then believe that you are putting the nation at risk. However, I read a statistic from a reputable magazine recently that we spend 13 times as much in our military as the world's second largest military, which is China. It seems like we're spending 13 times as much. That's a little bit drastic. We've got a little bit of too much of an advantage. Even the British, prior to World War I, spent twice as much on their Navy as the world's second largest Navy, and that was too much for them to sustain. So the fact that we're spending 13 times as much means that there's definitely too much money being spent on the military, and I think that's a drain on the economy.
I think you need to raise taxes, and I think that a lot of people have a taboo view on taxes because they hear the word and it's just, there's all this negative stigma. But if people want government to be more proactive and actually be able to afford to be proactive, taxes actually help people, and they don't end up costing anybody an inordinate amount of money. But I also think defense spending is a tricky one because it's more important than it's ever been, and if you're going to send people to war, you need to equip them. Like, you don't fight wars not to win, you fight wars to win as decisively as possible and lose as few lives as possible. So, in my opinion, you have to do what's necessary with defense regardless of the cost.
When you say tax increases, theoretically, yes, you could raise them enough to come up with, to solve any problem. But assuming that, there's some more reasonable tax increases, I really do think the main expense, though, is not defense. It's healthcare costs, Medicare and Medicaid, and that those things are only going to expand in the next few years because not only do you have healthcare costs increasing faster than anything else in our economy, but you have the segment of the population, the baby boom generation, which are retiring in great numbers, qualifying for Medicare, and it's almost unsustainable how many people are now going to be paid on Medicare.
Yeah, I do think we need to raise taxes on certain sectors of Americans. We cut taxes for all Americans under the Bush administration. We just had a blanket tax cut for all Americans. Well, that's great. That was in the early 2000s. We had actually had budget surpluses in the late 90s and in the year 2000. But it's been a long time since we had a budget surplus. And I think we needed to restructure the tax system so that we're able to raise enough revenue to pay for all these things that we want from our government. So yeah, I think that we need to raise taxes. I agree with Warren Buffett 100% that we should be taxing the super wealthy at a greater percentage than we are now. Warren Buffett pointed out that he only pays 17% of his income in taxes, whereas the average American is paying 29%. I mean, that's a regressive tax structure when you're taxing the upper class at a lower rate than the working class.
I don't think wealthy people should be taxed disproportionately just because they're wealthy, but I do think that they should be taxed more in the sense that A, they can afford it, and B, if it impacts them less than it does people who aren't making as much money, then I don't see anything wrong with it. Reducing the size of government. I think at the federal level, you just have to look and see who needs to be there and who doesn't. So, like with George W. Bush, for example, he actually expanded the size of government with the Department of Homeland Security, which never existed until after 9/11. But I wouldn't necessarily get rid of the Department of Homeland Security because I think we still need it. But I think you just have to look at government, and if government can be downsized without affecting the services and the functionality of government, I think that might be another way.
If you want to increase revenue, you have to increase taxes. And I think if you want to increase taxes to solve the budget deficit that we have, you need to increase taxes on some of the sectors of the economy that are being undertaxed, like people making over $1 million a year. People who, because they're making that much, are also able to take advantage of a lot of tax loopholes. And so I think we need to close those loopholes. And I think we need to, like I said, raise taxes. If you're making, so if you're making over $1 million a year, you can keep money out of the country. You can keep it in Switzerland, you can keep it in the Cayman Islands, and I don't think we've prosecuted that aggressively as much as we could, because that's income that should be being taxed according to United States law. So that's one example of a loophole that could be closed.
Well, if I had the solutions, then
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'd be elected. But
I think it's a huge problem, and frankly, I really do think it's dragging down the whole economy. And I think it's a joke that our Congress can't figure this out, because a lot of the projections that I've heard, and you know, frankly, I get most of my news from the New York Times and National Public Radio, is that we are talking about moderate tax increases on the order of 1 or 2% for only certain sectors of the economy would begin to close the budget deficit. And the fact that politically we're unable to raise taxes on a minority of Americans by 1 or 2% makes me feel like the whole country is being bamboozled. Like, if somebody told me, like, yeah, we need to raise taxes, you know, by 1 or 2% on a small sector of Americans, that would allow us to start shrinking the budget deficit and allow us to start growing our economy again, I think that sounds pretty reasonable.
there's this committee in Congress right now that has about 8 days now to come up with a solution to to reduce deficit by $1.2 trillion. And everything can be on the table. So they can come up with it by raising revenue, they can come up with it by cutting programs, or of course probably a combination of the two. If they don't come up with a solution, then there are across-the-board automatic cuts. $600 billion, so half of it, would be from defense, and the other $600 billion would be from discretionary spending, other government programs, and Medicare and Medicaid are held exempt. So my only thing is that I feel like, so it's a good example watching this super committee try to come up to deal with the very issue that you guys are researching right now. To me, it shows that there's a real lack of political courage by both parties. Like, we are on the precipice of like these gigantic cuts in this huge issue that we can all agree on needs a solution. And even with the stakes being that high, we still are 8 days away, and there's no solution to these people are not willing to step up and make bold decisions and agree on things that are in all of our long-term best interests, only because, for whatever reason, for a lot of reasons, they're worried about pleasing the bases of their party. And so Republicans say that taxes are off the table, and Democrats say we can't touch these huge programs that are growing out of control. Well, as long as we have leaders, as long as we give the job to leaders and say solve the problem, and as long as those leaders don't have courage to do what's popular, to do what's unpopular maybe, then I don't think we'll ever solve the issue.
The government just needs to start focusing on what regular people need, not what these really self-centered, self-serving people that run huge corporations need after they act irresponsibly and criminally in some cases. I think you just have to start helping everyday people. And I think those types of policies, even though they may not be as popular by the people who are more closely linked to government, I think they'd be more popular amongst people like you and I who are just regular people. I don't think either our current president or George W. Bush are responsible for all of our debt. I think it's been a long time coming, but I think Congress has to work and compromise more in order to find a solution rather than being so polarized. Like this whole Tea Party movement on the right side versus, you know, all the Democrats on the left. It's one thing to be polarized, but when nobody's willing to compromise and the American people have to pay for it, I don't think people are doing what they're elected to do. I think you're there to compromise. That's your job, like legislate. And when people start getting personal and it's not objective anymore, I think government fails. And I think that's what's happened.